When we left off in part 2, Marcus and Malcolm Reese had confronted their older brother Terrence over $3 million in secretly diverted royalties, ending Bloodline as the world knew it, and leaving three brothers who had once been inseparable, living almost entirely disconnected lives for the 6 years that followed. This is part 3 of the Bloodline story, and it begins with a phone call none of them expected, one that would bring three estranged brothers back into the same room for the first time since that confrontation in their father's study. If you're just joining us, go back and watch parts 1 and 2 first, so this part makes sense. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 6 years almost to the month since the confrontation that had torn the family apart. Otis Reese, then 69 years old, had suffered a serious heart attack while working in the garden behind the house Marcus had purchased for his parents years earlier, collapsing in the grass where Loretta found him only minutes later. Unconscious but breathing, an ambulance arriving within 12 minutes, that both of them have since said felt like the longest 12 minutes of their entire lives. Loretta has described those minutes in vivid, specific detail in the rare interview where she discussed that morning, kneeling beside her husband in the grass, a garden trowel still in his hand, repeating his name over and over, while she waited for sirens she was not certain would arrive in time. Loretta called Marcus first, her voice, by his account, unrecognizable through the panic, telling him only that his father had collapsed and that she was following the ambulance to the hospital, unable to say much more before the call cut off. Marcus has said he stood frozen in his kitchen for several seconds after the call ended, the phone still in his hand, before the reality of what he had just heard fully registered, and he began moving on pure instinct, calling the airline, throwing clothes into a bag without fully thinking about what he was packing. Marcus called Malcolm immediately after, the two of them booking the first available flights back to Memphis from separate cities, both of them, in the disorienting scramble of packing bags and canceling scheduled commitments, arriving independently at the same difficult question neither wanted to say out loud. Someone needed to call Terrence. Marcus has said the decision to make that call fell to him almost by default, simply because he reached his phone first during the chaotic hour between hearing the news and boarding his flight, and because some part of him understood, without needing to discuss it with Malcolm, that a moment like this one did not leave room for the kind of careful distance the three of them had maintained for 6 years. He is described sitting in an airport terminal, thumb hovering over Terrence's contact information, a number he had not deleted despite 6 years of silence, unsure until the exact moment he pressed call whether he would actually go through with it, running through, in the span of those few seconds, every reason he had told himself over 6 years for why reaching out would be a mistake. Terrence answered on the second ring, and Marcus has said the sound of his brother's voice, after 6 years of silence, hit him with an intensity he was not prepared for, a strange collision of grief for their father, and a grief he realized, in that moment, he had never fully allowed himself to feel for the brother he had also effectively lost. He told Terrence what had happened as plainly as he could manage, and Terrence, according to Marcus, went completely silent for several seconds before asking only one question, whether their father was going to be okay, a question Marcus could not yet answer with any certainty. Terrence booked a flight of his own within the hour, telling colleagues at the small management firm he had been building that he needed to leave immediately for a family emergency, offering no further explanation to anyone at the time. All three brothers arrived at the same Memphis hospital within hours of each other that afternoon, converging in a waiting room none of them had ever expected to share again. Malcolm has described the moment he saw Terrence for the first time in 6 years as strange beyond anything he could have anticipated. Older, grayer at the temples than Malcolm remembered, standing awkwardly near the entrance of the waiting room, as though uncertain whether he had any right to be there at all. Hesitating for a long moment before finally crossing the room toward his brothers. Neither Malcolm nor Marcus said much to Terrence in those first hours, the three of them instead sitting in a loose triangle of plastic waiting room chairs, united by a fear for their father that momentarily outweighed everything that had happened between them, exchanging only the kind of brief, functional updates that the situation required, whether the doctors had provided any new information, whether anyone had eaten, whether their mother needed anything from the vending machines down the hall. Otis Reese survived the heart attack, though doctors informed the family that the damage to his heart was significant, requiring a lengthy recovery and a permanent reduction in the kind of physical activity he had always taken for granted. The days that followed, while their father remained hospitalized, forced a kind of proximity none of the three brothers had experienced since the confrontation years earlier. Shared meals in hospital cafeterias, overlapping visiting hours, quiet hallway conversations that began, almost accidentally, to edge toward topics beyond their father's condition. Malcolm has said the strangest part of that week was how quickly certain old rhythms reasserted themselves despite everything, small jokes between him and Terrence that neither of them planned, familiar gestures that belonged to a version of their relationship that had existed long before the betrayal, surfacing almost involuntarily under the weight of shared worry for their father. Loretta, watching her three sons occupy the same physical space for the first time in 6 years, has said she recognized immediately that something in the dynamic between them had shifted, not resolved. She has been careful to clarify, but shifted, softened at the edges in a way 6 years of silence and grief and, she suspects, quiet individual reflection had apparently done to each of them separately. She has said she made a deliberate choice during that hospital week not to push any of her sons toward reconciliation directly, having learned painfully from the years immediately following the original betrayal that forcing the timeline rarely worked, choosing instead simply to let proximity and shared concern for Otis do whatever work it was going to do on its own. It was during a quiet moment in the hospital cafeteria, roughly 4 days into Otis's recovery, that Terrence first raised, tentatively, something he had apparently been wanting to say for years. He told Marcus and Malcolm, according to both twins' later recollection, that he had spent much of the previous 6 years in therapy, work he had begun not long after the settlement, initially at his own attorney's suggestion but continuing long after any legal necessity for it had passed, work that had forced him to sit with the specific damage he had caused in a way the confrontation and litigation alone had never fully allowed him to process. He did not ask for forgiveness in that conversation. Both twins have said, careful, it seemed, not to make the moment about his own need for absolution during a week that was supposed to be about their father. But he did say, plainly, that he understood if neither of them ever wanted a relationship with him again, and that he would respect that completely if it was what they chose. Malcolm has described that conversation as the first moment in 6 years where he genuinely believed Terrence understood the full weight of what he had done, not simply the financial betrayal itself, but the deeper wound of having exploited a trust built over an entire lifetime. He has said he did not respond with any promise of reconciliation in that moment, unwilling to make a decision that significant in the emotionally raw atmosphere of a hospital cafeteria, but that something in him softened, almost against his will, hearing his brother speak with a kind of honesty he had never quite managed during the confrontation 6 years earlier. Otis was discharged from the hospital 9 days after his heart attack, returning home to a lengthy recovery period that required, per his doctor's recommendations, regular family support and monitoring given the severity of the cardiac event. It was Loretta, practical as always, even amid her own exhaustion, who suggested that all 3 sons take turns staying at the house during the initial weeks of Otis's recovery, a suggestion born purely out of logistical necessity, but one that, in practice, forced Marcus, Malcolm, and Terrence into an extended period of shared responsibility and shared space, unlike anything they had experienced since childhood. The rotation itself became, almost by accident, a structure that made reconciliation possible in a way a single deliberate conversation likely never could have. Each brother took roughly week-long shifts staying at the house, handling their father's medication schedule, driving him to follow-up appointments, sitting with him through the frustration of a recovery that moved far slower than a man used to physical labor, his entire life, found easy to accept. The overlap days, when one brother's shift ended and another's began, created brief windows of forced interaction, a shared dinner, a joint conversation with Otis's cardiologist, moments that none of them could easily avoid without it becoming obviously, awkwardly deliberate. Marcus has described one particular overlap day in detail, arriving to relieve Terrence from his shift and finding his brother in the kitchen, attempting, with limited success, to recreate their mother's recipe for a specific soup Otis had been craving, flour dusted across the counter, a cookbook propped open against the toaster, Terrence looking, in Marcus's words, more human and more vulnerable than Marcus had seen him in years, frustrated by a recipe, rather than defending himself in a deposition. The two of them ended up cooking together that evening, neither planning it, simply falling into the familiar rhythm of working alongside each other in a kitchen, the way they had as children helping their mother. Over the following 2 months, a fragile but genuine thaw began to take shape between the three brothers, built not on any single dramatic reconciliation, but on the accumulated weight of small moments. Terrence and Malcolm sitting together on the porch one evening while their father slept, falling into an easy conversation about music neither of them had planned. Marcus and Terrence spending an afternoon fixing a fence together in near total silence, that somehow felt less like avoidance and more like the comfortable, wordless companionship they had shared as children. Malcolm has described one particular evening during this period in detail, sitting with Terrence on that same porch where their father had once taught all three of them guitar chords. Terrence picking up the old instrument still mounted nearby and playing, haltingly, a few bars of a song from their childhood, both of them ending up laughing at how rusty his fingers had become. A small, unremarkable moment that Malcolm has said felt, in the context of everything, quietly monumental. Marcus has described a similar turning point of his own, working alongside Terrence to repair a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair during their father's illness. Neither of them speaking for nearly an hour, focused entirely on the physical task in front of them, until Terrence finally broke the silence to ask, almost offhandedly, whether Marcus remembered the specific summer their father had taught all three of them to change a tire in that same driveway. A memory Marcus realized, once Terrence brought it up, he had not thought about in years, buried under everything that had happened since. He has said that small shared memory, more than any formal conversation, was the moment he first felt something in himself soften toward the possibility of a real relationship with his brother again. None of the three brothers has ever described this period as forgiveness in any complete sense, but rather as the slow, uneven beginning of something that might eventually become forgiveness, given enough time and enough evidence that the trust being carefully extended would not be broken again. Loretta has said she watched this unfold with a kind of cautious hope she was almost afraid to fully feel, having learned, over 6 painful years, not to assume any single good moment meant the underlying wound was actually healing, rather than simply being set aside temporarily under the pressure of a family crisis. It was Otis himself, according to Loretta's later account, who first raised the idea of a full reunion, sitting on the same porch where he had once taught his sons guitar chords, telling all three of his boys during a family dinner, roughly 3 months after his heart attack, that he did not know how many more years he had left, and that watching them slowly find their way back to each other during his recovery had been, without exaggeration, the greatest gift any of them could have given him. He did not explicitly ask for a musical reunion, both twins have said, but the emotional weight of the moment planted a seed that none of the three brothers could fully ignore in the weeks that followed. Malcolm has said his father's words that evening carried a particular weight, given everything the family had just been through with his health. A reminder that time, which had once felt infinite, no longer felt that way to any of them. The conversation about an actual professional reunion began cautiously, initiated by Malcolm roughly a month later, floating the idea first to Marcus alone during a phone call neither of them has fully detailed publicly. Both twins acknowledging real hesitation, given everything the three of them had been through. Marcus has said his initial instinct was resistance, not because he doubted Terrence's genuine growth over the previous 6 years, which he had come to believe was real, but because he worried about what a public reunion might mean for a trust that, however improved, it still felt newer and more fragile than the world would likely assume once cameras and contracts entered the picture again. He has described lying awake for several nights during this period, weighing the very real, professional, and emotional upside of a reunion against a fear he could never quite silence entirely. That history, once it has already repeated a pattern this specific, tends to find ways of repeating itself again. The eventual decision to move forward came only after extensive conversation between all three brothers, conversations that both twins have described as more honest and more difficult than almost anything from the original confrontation years earlier, precisely because this time, the stakes were rebuilding rather than uncovering. Terrence, notably, did not push for a return to any formal management role during these discussions. Both twins have confirmed, insisting instead that any involvement he had going forward would need to be structured with full transparency and independent financial oversight from the very beginning, a boundary he proposed himself before either brother had to ask for it, a gesture both Marcus and Malcolm have said mattered significantly in their eventual decision to move forward. Terence has said, in one of the few interviews he gave following the reunion's announcement, that he understood he would need to earn back trust in increments, through consistent, verifiable behavior over time, rather than through any single gesture or promise, however sincere. The reunion was announced publicly nearly 7 years after Bloodline's original breakup, in a joint statement that, for the first time, offered fans a partial but genuine account of what had actually happened between the brothers, framed carefully around themes of family, forgiveness, and growth, rather than the specific financial details still protected by the original settlement's confidentiality provisions. The announcement generated an overwhelming public response. Media coverage across every major entertainment outlet, an outpouring of emotional reactions from longtime fans who had spent nearly 7 years wondering what had really happened to the trio. They had once considered the picture of family success in the music industry. The reunion tour that followed became, by nearly every measure, one of the most successful comeback stories the industry had witnessed in years, selling out arenas within minutes across every major market, driven by a genuine public hunger to witness the reconciliation playing out in real time on stage. Ticket brokers reported the reunion announcement generating demand that outpaced even Bloodline's original peak years, a testament, industry analysts noted at the time, to how deeply the original story of family and betrayal, even in its partially disclosed public form, had resonated with an audience that had grown up on the group's music. Marcus and Malcolm performed alongside a new, formally structured management arrangement, with Terence taking on a limited advisory role specifically focused on creative and strategic direction rather than direct financial control, an arrangement designed deliberately, all three brothers have said, to allow Terence a meaningful path back into their professional lives without recreating the exact conditions that had led to catastrophe the first time. The opening night of the reunion tour, held fittingly in Memphis, became one of the most emotional performances of either twin's career, surpassing even the hometown show from years earlier that Marcus had once described as the most meaningful night of his life. The arena sold out within 11 minutes of tickets going on sale, with fans traveling from across the country specifically for that opening date, aware, even without full knowledge of the family's private history, that they were witnessing something rare, a reunion built on genuine, unresolved emotional stakes, rather than simple commercial opportunity. Otis and Loretta sat in the front row once again, watching all three of their sons share a stage together for the first time in nearly 7 years. Terence standing just off to the side during the performance itself, visible to the audience in a supporting capacity that felt, to those who understood the full history, quietly significant in its own right. Backstage that night, according to accounts from crew members present, all three brothers embraced for an extended moment before the show began, a moment none of them have ever fully described publicly, though Malcolm has said, in the one interview where he came closest to discussing it directly, that it was the first time in nearly 7 years he felt something close to whole again, as a family, however imperfect, and however carefully, that wholeness had needed to be rebuilt. One longtime crew member, who had worked with Bloodline during both their original run and the reunion tour, described the atmosphere backstage that night as unlike anything he had witnessed in over 20 years in the touring industry, a palpable mixture of excitement and something closer to reverence, as though everyone present understood they were watching a genuinely rare thing unfold in real time. For nearly 18 months following that opening night, the reunion appeared, by every external measure, to be exactly the redemption story fans and family alike had hoped for. The tour grossed record-breaking numbers, eventually becoming one of the highest-grossing R&B tours in over a decade, according to industry trade publications tracking the circuit. A new joint album, the first the three brothers had worked on together in any capacity in over a decade, was announced to significant industry anticipation, with early singles receiving warm critical reception that noted a maturity and emotional depth in the new material that reviewers directly attributed to everything the group had lived through during their years apart. Terrence's advisory role expanded gradually over this period. His genuine strategic instincts, the same instincts that had once helped build Bloodline from nothing, once again proving valuable, as the group navigated a rapidly changed music industry landscape that had transformed considerably during their years apart. An industry now shaped far more by streaming economics and social media presence than the radio-driven model that had defined their original rise. It was during preparations for that new joint album, nearly 2 years after the reunion began, that a financial decision was made, seemingly small and reasonable at the time, that would eventually prove to carry far more significance than any of the three brothers understood in the moment they agreed to it. What that decision was, and what it would ultimately reveal about whether people, even people who have done genuine work to change, can fully escape the patterns that once defined them, is where part 4 of this story begins. Do you believe 6 months or 6 years is ever truly enough to rebuild trust after a betrayal this deep? Or do you think some wounds, no matter how much time passes, remain permanently vulnerable to reopening? Let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss part 4, where everything the Reese family rebuilt is tested in a way none of them saw coming.